I'm joined now by Marwan Bishara, Al Jazeera's senior political analyst. Good to have you with us. So we want to talk a little bit, Marwan, about what the strategy will be going forward, especially in light of the statements we heard from the US Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations, where he basically said no ceasefire that would leave Hamas standing or Hamas in power. What does that mean? Unending, open-ended war?
Yeah. I think Israel is ready for an open-ended war. It will come under pressure by the United States. It will come under economic pressure because there is a cost to this war. But fortunately, the United States is providing diplomatic immunity, and it's providing, for the time being, perhaps $14 billion to cover up for the war costs thus far.
But Marwan, what if time proves what many military strategists are warning, that the goal of completely eradicating Hamas is simply not going to happen? And after 2 months, it certainly hasn't happened.
Well, we won't know, right? I mean, look how it all started. It all started by both Netanyahu and Biden comparing Hamas to ISIS and to Al-Qaeda. The war against Al-Qaeda has gone on for 20 years. The war against terror has gone on for that much, and it's still continuing. The war against Iraq went on for 10 years. I think Israel considers its war against the Palestinians even more important than America's war against Afghanistan, Iraq. It considers it an existential war. I'll go further than that. I tell you, I think Israel as an entity, as a project, it feels more at ease during war than it does during peacetime or so-called peace process time. You know, from 1991, for 12 dozen years or so, Israel changed 6 or 7 governments during the peace process time. From Shamir to Rabin to Peres to Netanyahu to Barak to Sharon to Olmert. It changed 7 prime ministers, right? And then when it stopped with the peace process and came Netanyahu, we had 1 prime minister for 13 years. In fact, it's more stable. Israel is more stable when it's not in a peacetime or peace process time. It does not have an issue with being a state at war because since its creation, it's been a state at war. It's a garrison state. So the military establishment and the far right and the fanatics and the fascists in the Israeli government, all of them feed on violence. And they would want to have a state of war so they can destroy Gaza and they can reoccupy the West Bank and kick out the Palestinian Authority and establish more and more settlements, double, triple the settlements there, and try to squeeze out the Palestinians.
To what extent would the US go along with that? Is that sort of scenario in US interests?
Well, do we know if Biden is going to be there, you know, in a year's time? We don't know. What we know is that he boxed himself in behind Netanyahu. He begged Netanyahu and the Israeli government to buy him some time, meaning just give him something like humanitarian, this, that, and the other thing. Agree with him on the two-state idea. Anything that he can sell to the rest of the world so he can keep shielding Israel. But they won't give him anything. And still, he's boxing himself behind Netanyahu. And that's what explains the vote yesterday. So for the time being, the United States understands that this kind of a warfare, as they fought it against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, took 20 years. If Israel is going to take 20 months, then let it be 20 months. I think for the time being, Israel considers what it does, it must do, and the world can say whatever it wants.
Okay, but this is not the pre-Oslo days in terms of the global balance of power. So coming back to the battlefield, the longer that this can drag out, does it risk dragging in more countries into this conflict? Or do you see that sort of scenario that people were talking about in the first weeks after this, that's not so likely anymore?
For the time being, what we see is that Iran is distancing itself from the scenario of war. And we see the United States remains with its deployment of aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines and still pushing and pumping arms to Israel. So Israel is continuing with the war. And I think in so many ways, Israel, as I said, needs the war for the time being in order to establish a number of its own red lines, right? Including settlements, ethnic cleansing, and so on and so forth. So I think it doesn't have much of a problem with that, even regionally. Yes, America warns that on the long term, it will start losing allies or potential allies that normalized relations with Israel. But for the time being, we're not saying that. Now, we are now, for the time being, we're talking about months, perhaps 1 month, 2 more months of the land invasion. And then the war could change to something else. Perhaps something that looks like more of incursions, security zones, and squeezing the Palestinians out slowly but surely. I think that kind of I'm not going to call it low-intensity warfare, but whatever the next stage of the war is going to be, Israel is going to decide, and it's going to go by it, and it doesn't care what the rest of the world says. If Trump steps in November or January 2025, then they're going to have another ally in the White House that will support them and support what they need to do.
It'll be a whole different ballgame. So much more to talk about, but we're going to leave it here for now, perhaps a little later. Thanks so much, Marwan Bishara.